Being here in this setting reminds me of being out there when I was out there for the first several weeks of this pandemic. And I got to tell you, my wife and I would sit there. I was wearing shorts and a T-shirt without shoes, and she the same. And one of the services that meant so much started like this. The pastor, and they actually recorded the service ahead of time on about the Thursday or Friday ahead of time. And when the pastors came in to record, unknown to them, one of the administrative assistants had asked everyone to send in their latest pictures, and they had them enlarged and on each of the seats. And I got to tell you, the pastor started weeping. He missed the people that much. And I got to tell you, we miss you and are looking so much forward to being together with you again in the near future. Plans are being made, and by God's grace and favor, we will be together again. Now, it'll be a different kind of setting at first. We're going to have to keep each other safe and the social distancing and all of that, but it's going to be really good, and we're looking forward to it. One of the things I love about having been a part of several churches is I've met many wonderful people. I was here from 1983 through 1995, and I was so honored to be your pastor. And one of the families that I met at that time was the Whitaker family. There was Ed, and there was Linda, and there was Jessica and Jennifer, and they were very, very active in the church. And Ed and their family had moved from Kansas, where he was a top executive with Southwestern Bell. And while he was here, he became the CEO of Southwestern Bell. And I remember one time, to give you a window of what Ed was like, remember one time early morning driving downtown St. Louis, and as I stopped at a light, I happened to look over as another car pulled up, and it was kind of a plain car. It was nice, but not overly fancy. And as I looked over, the window comes down, and there's Ed with a big smiling face and saying hello to me. Well, Ed lost a lot of fans when he moved the Southwestern Bell from St. Louis to his home state of Texas, to the charming city of San Antonio. And can you believe it? When I got to San Antonio, I found out as I was in a worship service early in the morning that there was Ed and Linda. They were a member of that church, members of that church. And it was so special to make the reconnection again. But at that time, Ed had retired, but had been tapped on the shoulder and had become the CEO of none other than General Motors. The president asked him to take over so that they wouldn't go into bankruptcy, and he was trying to help turn things around. To give you another further window into who he was and who they were, every Sunday they would come through a back door down the center aisle. And when they would receive a bulletin outside, they would receive it from none other than a man named Philip. Now, Philip had been taken under their wings there at the church, and they'd loved on him a lot, and he had become one of the greeters. He was a homeless guy that you would see on the streets during the week, but he was there handing out bulletins, and he would be handing them out to Ed and Linda as they came in. And one of the most poignant scenes that's indelibly etched upon my memory is one time when we were doing communion by intinction. That's where people come down the center aisle, and we serve them in the front. Well, Philip was on this side, and Ed was on this side, and they were about the same place. And when they came down the center aisle, they came down that center aisle together. And the image of those two men side by side, very different situations in life, but very much followers of Jesus. And I thought, this is a foretaste of heaven. Well, one of the times when I had lunch with Ed, he said to me, "Jim, you and I are doing the same thing." I wasn't going to argue with him, but I didn't quite think we were doing the same thing, since he was the CEO of General Motors, but he said it several times. And there was a sense in which he really meant it, because he realized that his job was kind of be an interim CEO. And he knew who he wasn't. He wasn't going to be the person who was going to be there forever. He was just there for a season. And he did leave. And after he had prepared the way and helped to turn the company in the right direction, and then he did prepare the way for the new CEO who came. This morning we're going to look at a person in the Bible who I believe is most like what Ed was talking about when he said, Jim, you and I are doing the same thing. He's the person who is most like what I, by God's grace, want to be as I spend these months with you this summer. And maybe, just maybe, is a model for all of us living in the world that we live in, a world that's full of transitions. Of course, I'm speaking of none other than the biblical character, John the Baptist. He appears on the scene when Israel had not experienced a prophet from God for several centuries. They hadn't heard a word from the Lord like they needed to. In some ways, he is like the hinge between the Old Testament and the New Testament. When we look at John 1 through 19, and I want us to read that passage first of all. Let's look at John 1, and I'm going to be reading verses 19 through 28. John 1, 19 through 28. Listen now as you read on the screen or you have your Bibles what God would say to us in his word this morning. This is the testimony of John, when the Jews sent priests and Levites from Jerusalem to ask him, "Who are you?" He confessed and did not deny, but confessed, "I am not the Christ." And they asked him, "What then? Are you Elijah?" He said, "I am not." "Are you the prophet?" And he answered, "No." So they said to him, "Who are you? We need to give an answer to those who sent us. What do you say about yourself?" He said, "I am the voice of one crying in the wilderness, 'Make straight the way of the Lord,' as the prophet Isaiah said." Now, they had been sent from the Pharisees. They asked him, "Then why are you baptizing, if you are neither the Christ, nor Elijah, nor the prophet?" John answered them, "I baptize with water, but among you stands one you do not know, even he who comes after me, the strap of whose sandal I am not worthy to untie." These things took place in Bethany, across the Jordan, where John was baptizing. The first thing we see in this passage is that John the Baptist knew who he was not. After the prologue, where John, the gospel writer, turns our attention then to John the Baptist. Now, the Jewish leaders are becoming a little bit uncomfortable. They've heard word that all kinds of people are going down to the Jordan River, and there they're being baptized by none other than this son of Zechariah, who was a priest. And in those days, the Jewish leaders were desperately concerned about no one usurping their power. And another thing that was a little bit strange is he was baptizing Jews. And in their tradition, they didn't baptize Jews, they baptized Gentiles when they became proselytes or became Jews. So the Jewish leaders at headquarters in Jerusalem decide they're going to send an investigative team to find out John's true identity, and then they are to come back, make a report, so they can determine who and what they're going to do. Their question to John the Baptist simply at the beginning was, "Who are you?" Great question. And knowing their purpose and asking the question, John quickly responds, "I am not the Christ," or "I am not the Messiah, the anointed one." They believed, as do many of our Jewish friends, that the Messiah was yet to come, and that he would come bringing peace. He would be setting up a reign of righteousness. All this would happen as he delivered the people by overthrowing the oppressors, and in that time it was the Romans. Unlike the false wannabe messiahs of the day, and there had been several of them, John immediately clears the air. He was not the Messiah. I don't know about you, but I think sometimes it seems to me that we have what I might call messianic complexes, thinking that we have to be the ones who deliver people from all kinds of problems, that we are sent from God to make every situation right, that we are the anointed ones who have all the answers. But don't get me wrong. We are to be peacemakers. We're to be reconcilers. We're to be out there seeking to build Christ's kingdom of righteousness and goodness in the world in which we live. But you know what? We can't and don't have to play the role in our lives of being God, of being Christ, of being the Messiah. I don't know about you, but for me, that's a real sense of relief, knowing that I am not the Messiah. The next question asked by the contingent from headquarters, as they're getting just a little bit worried here, is, are you Elijah? Again, that was a natural question on a couple of levels. It was a Jewish belief that Elijah would return and prepare the way for the Messiah. So if you're not the Messiah, are you Elijah returning to set the stage for him, they were thinking? In addition, John the Baptist was dressed and ate the same kind of cuisine as did Elijah. And, you know, if the truth might be known, he might have been kind of a hero of Elijah, of John the Baptist. Elijah might have been. But he simply says, I am not. Certainly the answer did not give them a lot to work with still in making that report. How about you? Are there people you have tried to emulate? Growing up in southwestern Michigan, I was a fan of the Detroit Tigers, and my favorite player was none other than an all-star named Al Kaline, who died recently. And in high school, I wore number 6, Kaline's number. The only home run I ever hit in high school, I hit with an Al Kaline bat. And I played right field like Kaline did, and I prided myself in having a strong arm to throw out runners. As I got older and I became a pastor, there were pastors and professors I greatly admired and consciously or subconsciously copied them, tried to be like them. But you know what? In both cases, that's not who God created me to be or purposed me to be. Again, realizing who I wasn't was a liberating understanding for me. I didn't have to try to be someone I wasn't. How about you? Can you imagine the anxiety level of these inquisitors and how it must have been rising? And so they ask him, are you the prophet? Now, with that question, they're probably thinking of a specific person who was prophesied and predicted in Deuteronomy 18:15. He was going to be like a prophet on steroids. He was going to be one who would return and be like Isaiah or Jeremiah. And there's a sense in which they're thinking this person would be the epitome. He would be a super prophet. In genuine humility, John's answer is even shorter. He says, no. Maybe we find ourselves at times thinking that we have to be a super this or a super that. We have to be the very best, which means we have to be better than everyone else. Only one person can be the best. You ever feel that way? It's not a bad thing if that's what God has created you to be. But again, only one person can be the best. In this very competitive world in which we live, especially here in West County, think about we can be content with simply being what God calls us to be. I don't have to make the most money with the best job. I don't have to have the biggest house, go on the nicest and most exciting vacations, attend the most prestigious schools, have the nicest car, or have the perfect kids. Like John, there is great satisfaction in knowing who we are not. I got to tell you, when I was a pastor here, I remember vividly annual personnel or annual performance review that I had by the Personnel Committee. And the Personnel Committee was made up of people that I genuinely liked and admired. And while they may have shared some good things, I don't remember them, but I remember the one thing that they said that truly troubled me. They said, Jim, we wish you were more like a CEO. In fact, we wish you were more like the CEO of Monsanto. My mind went through all of the people who had come to see me every time the CEO of Monsanto led a reorganization where people were feeling like they were unfairly treated. And so I'm sure there were things I needed to learn and things I needed to do better, so they weren't all wrong. But I responded defensively, and I said, if you want a CEO, I'm not your guy. Well, as you can imagine, that annual review didn't end real well. Shortly after that, I saw an article in Leadership magazine by a Christian businessman, and it was titled, Pastor, not CEO, but Maestro. I loved what he had to say. And so I quickly copied off that article and sent it to the members of the Personnel Committee so they would see what I was talking about. And to their credit, they liked the idea, and they realized what I was trying to be, what I was aspiring to be. As we move a little bit further here, John the Baptist does have an understanding of who he was and what he was called to be and do. Well, as you might imagine, again, the task force from headquarters is very frustrated. So far, the report has, I am not the Christ, no, I am not, and then no. That was the kind of investigative report that would never win them the plaudits of their superiors. In fact, they might not have a job waiting for them if they didn't come up with more information about John. So at what I imagine was kind of a fever pitch, they say, well then who are you? We need to give an answer to those who sent us. What do you say about yourself? And then, with what I believe was kind of a passionate confidence, John responds by quoting Isaiah 40, verse 3. I am the voice of one crying in the wilderness, make straight the way of the Lord. Now, he was presenting an image about which they were very familiar. For in those days, when a king would come, there would be a contingent that would be ahead of him, and because the roads were made out of dirt, they would go, and where there were ruts in the roads, they'd try to smooth them out, or bumps, or even turns, they would try to straighten them out. And also, before a king would come, there would be a herald that would go before him. And the herald would cry, the king is coming, make way for the king. So that's exactly what John's talking about. He's not the king, but he's preparing the way for the king. Now, since they had been sent specifically from the Pharisees, the experts in the law and tradition and those who were the keepers of orthodoxy in the Jewish faith, they had been instructed to ask about baptism. Since John was not the Messiah, he was not Elijah, he was not the prophet, why then was he baptizing? On what authority could he baptize? Again, only Gentiles were baptized in their tradition and not Jews. Again, understanding who he was and what was his mission, he points to Jesus when he says, I baptize with water, but among you stands one you do not know, even he who comes after me, the strap of whose sandal I am not worthy to untie. Way to be, John. I like what he had to say there. You knew who you weren't as well as who you were. And he further illustrates the reality of his understanding the next day when he sees Jesus and he says, behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. I myself did not know him, but for this purpose I came baptizing with water that he might be revealed to Israel. Then John tells them of his experience in baptizing Jesus. And then the next day, John is standing with a couple of his disciples, and I can only imagine that he has mentored these disciples. Into them he has poured himself in a great way with a sense of passion. But when he sees Jesus, it's as if he passes them off and says, look, the Lamb of God. And from that time forth, they followed Jesus. And then again, in John chapter 3, verse 30, it was John who could say, he must increase, speaking of Jesus, and I must decrease. You might find it interesting that several years ago, I used this passage, John 1, 19 through 28, when John the Baptist knew who he wasn't as well as he was, for a chapel service from the then St. Louis Rams, and I don't want to hear hissing and booing at this point, before they had a Monday night football game with the Colts, and that was in Indianapolis. After the chapel, as is usually the custom, I was invited to eat the pregame meal with the Rams. I sat with none other than Adam Timmerman, who was kind of the player representative for the chapel. And he was an offensive lineman, as many of you might know, a big guy. And I sat at a table with all offensive linemen. I got to tell you, I felt rather small that day. It doesn't happen often, but I did. And since I knew the Rams had gone to 2 Super Bowls, it wasn't long until in our conversation I said, Adam, I know you were a part of 2 Super Bowls. What was that like? He says, Jim, you don't understand. I've been a part of 4 Super Bowls. I have 2 NFC championship rings and 2 Super Bowl rings. I was with the Packers before I was with the Rams. At that point, I about went through the ceiling with excitement and said, wow, Adam, what was that like? He answered, it was overhyped. There's nothing you could do to live up to the kind of hype they give the Super Bowl. And then he went on to say, what we've just talked about in chapel services, the service, is really what it's all about. That's much more important than any Super Bowl. Well, not the answer I expected, to be sure. I certainly couldn't have agreed more. Even with the acclaim of being a Super Bowl champion, that wasn't what was most important, and he understood that. He knew who he wasn't, as well as who he was really called to be. How about you this morning? What might God be saying to you as you think about who you aren't and thus don't have to be? Name it right now. Could it be that a load is lifted from your shoulders when you realize you don't have to be all things to all people? Who is God calling Bonham not to be, and then to be? We can't be all things to all people. I remember when we were going to move to a brand new ministry site, 30 acres right off of an interstate in Indianapolis, that we spent lots of time, and it wasn't an easy time, talking about who are we not going to be and who are we going to be, realizing that we couldn't do everything, that we weren't called to be everything to everyone. And we finally decided, and this wasn't easy for some to accept, but we coalesced and agreed that we wanted to reach out to families with young children so that every decision we made after that, we made on the basis of that focus. And I want to tell you, it really went well by the power of God's Spirit. And every year we became a little bit younger, a little bit younger, and a little bit younger. God did a special thing. No matter who we aren't and who we are, all of us are called to point to Jesus. We're called to be prophets, as it were. The church should not be a non-profit organization. We're pointers to Jesus, and that should be etched on the very spiritual DNA of every one of us. Just like John the Baptist, we are to point to Jesus. Let me close with this illustration. When I was in seminary, I had a professor, an Old Testament professor that I dearly loved. And I decided my last semester that I would take an independent Hebrew word study. And when I took that independent Hebrew word study for that professor, I was doing it on the call of the prophets in the Old Testament, of course. And there had been a scholar whom my professor had mentioned often, a Hebrew scholar named Abraham Heschel out of New York City. And he had written a 2-volume work on the prophets. And so I heard that Heschel was coming to the University of Louisville. So I quickly hurried over there, and I hoped that I would get a quote that I could take back and write in my paper, and I would impress and maybe bless my professor. Well, as I got to the lecture, I found out that Heschel did not say one word that would fit in my report. So after he was finished, I got in line, and I finally got up to him after about 20 minutes, and I said, Dr. Heschel, are there prophets today? And he looked at me and he said, yes, and he went to the next person. I didn't know what to do about that, so I got back in line again, and this time I only waited about 15 minutes. And when I got close to him, I'm sure he was thinking, oh no, here he comes again. And when I got up to him, I said, Dr. Heschel, if there are prophets today, who are they? And he simply said in wonderful Hebraic fashion, there is a little bit of prophet in all of us. And then he went to the next person. Well, it was a short answer. It was a great one. And it said to me, and I've used it many times, that all of us are called to be like John the Baptist. That is to point to Jesus, understanding that Jesus is the one who came as God's Son, who came to bring us new life, who came to overcome the old life. As we refresh our focus, we need to know who we aren't as a church and as individuals, then also who we are and who we're called to be. But all of us, no matter what, need to point to Jesus, to be preparing the way for the Lord in our world today. Please join me in prayer. Good and gracious God, as we come to you this morning, we're so grateful that your word speaks to us in all times and seasons. I mean, written many years ago, but it's appropriate. It's so important for us as we live our lives here on the good planet Earth in the year 2020. So God, I pray that as only you can do, you would continue to apply your word to our lives, that we might accomplish your purpose. Help us to know who we aren't, and help us also to know who you've called us to be. Help us to be pointers to Jesus. I pray all of these things now in the name of the risen and the reigning Lord, even Jesus the Christ. Amen.